Hi, boosters. Welcome to our boosted volunteer webinar on Booster Club budgeting, hosted by BoosterHub. I'm Robin Eissler, and I'm the CEO and founder of BoosterHub, a software application designed to help streamline operations in booster clubs. Today, we're going to go over budgets and how they impact your booster club. So, the things we're going to cover are why are budgets the foundation of a booster club? Who should be involved? What tools to use, when you should budget and drafting your budget, the budgeting process, how much to budget, approvals and use, and insights that can be gained from your budget. The most frightening thing I've ever heard from a booster club was, we don't have a budget. We just write checks when the coach asks. This is such a scary quote because it means a lot of things. It means that the booster club had no idea how much money they planned to spend for the year, no idea when that money was going to be due, and no idea how they were going to raise it. The likely scenario is that they had a plan, they just didn't put it on paper. The budget is the foundation of the booster club. It provides a roadmap for the organization, and it makes your game plan and a promise of how you're going to get there. When you agree to fund your sports program with $20,000 a year, you're agreeing to fundraise that amount as well. The budget also lays the foundation for your accounting principles. So when you create your budget, you're likely going to walk through some of your accounting practices as well. The budget process will help you avoid pitfalls and things like money unaccounted for or perhaps fraud in your booster club. It also simplifies decision making. If you have a budget, there's no question whether or not something's going to be paid for if it's in the budget and has been approved. And most importantly, in a booster club, the budget is often the only financial statement that a booster club produces. While a lot of nonprofits, bigger nonprofits with full-time staffs, have a full suite of accounting reports, typically in a booster club, the treasurer position is held by a volunteer. And so the report that they can manage to bring to most board meetings is a budget or a budget versus the actual report. Who should be involved in your budgeting process? Well, you're going to want to start with all the stakeholders. So obviously you're going to want to have your director or your teacher or your coach. They're going to need to tell you how much you need to support your program for the year. Executive board members should all be involved. These would be your officers like your president, your vice president, treasurer, secretary. And you're also going to determine how you're going to raise that money that the coach or the director has asked for. Your school district may need to be involved. Oftentimes, the chief financial officer of the school district or someone in operations is involved with the individual booster clubs and their budgeting and financial process. And you need to find out what the school district requires from a financial review process. Your booster club members should be involved because they need to know what they need to do to obtain the numbers that you've set for the year. And then finally, previous board members who've set the budgets in the past can be helpful resources to give you some idea whether things need to be increased or decreased or where money was spent in the past. There are quite a few tools that you can use to do the budgeting process. You can start simply with a piece of paper and a pencil and start line iteming the items that you want to have in your budget, income and expenses. Paper and journal can become time intensive if your program has a lot of transactions over the course of the year. You can use a spreadsheet. Excel and Google Sheets do a great job creating a simple budget and then tracking those against your budget, your actual numbers against your budgeted numbers. It can be challenging in a spreadsheet to get to multiple layers of detail, so it's something you may want to consider. Accounting software is a great tool, and a lot of them offer a budgeting tool. The initial setup may be a little longer in an accounting software, but going forward, it automatically puts your figures in your budget, so it's a lot easier than the paper or the spreadsheet option. A lot of times in a booster club, the budget actually becomes the working accounting document where you're actually adding those numbers into the budget. And so you want to think about if that's happening or if the budget's just a view of transactions happening someplace else. So depending on your structure, you may want to set up your budget differently. I go back to the we don't have a budget. We just write checks when the coach asks, because that really makes me ask a lot of questions. One of the most important ones is, how do you prevent fraud in your booster club if you don't know what you're supposed to be spending and what you spent? When should you draft your budget? Typically, you're going to draft your budget at the end of the previous fiscal year, most likely 1 to 3 months before your fiscal year has started. You'll want to gather a small team, probably your executive board members, and bring them together to create the numbers. You don't want too many involved in that first drafting round process, as it may make it really complicated. Then finally, you're going to want to present and approve the budget, likely to your entire booster club. It's helpful to have all members involved in that approval process and public approval, because this clearly sets the roadmap for your organization and gives the promise, we're going to raise this much money, we're going to spend this much money in a public forum. When you're starting the process of the budget, the first thing you want to do is start with the end in mind. How much money do you need to raise across the course of the year? You want to keep the budget as simple as you can. So you want to keep it simple enough that it's easy to read and see your progress, but you don't want to leave out key numbers or important factors. You'll want to follow the guidelines, both your school district, any sports or music association, state guidelines, and IRS guidelines. And then most importantly, you want to ask questions. What information do we need to know? What information do we need to see in our budget? As you start the process, you're going to begin to structure your budget through your chart of accounts. Again, we're going to go back and ask questions. What's required? What questions will our members and our directors be asking? What buckets do we have? And by buckets, I'm speaking of your chart of accounts. What different types of income do you have? What different types of expenses do you have? And how detailed do you want your budget to be? Here's a sample budget from the Bay District School Booster Board of how this school district wants to see that information. They want to see income and expenses broken down into these items and this basic information. This may be all you need for your booster club and could easily be done on a spreadsheet. Let's look at what's required from the IRS perspective. If your booster club does less than $50,000 annually, the only tax document that you have to file is a 990N tax return. And the only thing that a 990N asks for is your total revenue. So that's the only number required by the IRS for a booster club that does less than $50,000 a year. That number probably isn't enough to give you insight into what's happening in your booster club. So we're going to move on to the 990EZ, and this is where most booster clubs fall, where you're doing greater than $50,000 a year and less than $200,000. And we'll move on to that. This is what the IRS 990EZ tax return looks like. I bring this document up because it's, again, starting with the end in mind. If you know at the end of the year you've got to put your numbers in this format, it's a great place to get started with the structure of your budget. You can start with the contributions, gifts, and grants, the program income, membership dues, your money that you make in fundraising and merchandise, and then offset with your expenses. And here it's outlined in detail the different categories that the IRS wants to see on this return. This is why I think this is a great place to start, because it's not only going to help you build some structure into your budget, but it's also going to make you ask questions like, what's the difference between a contribution, a gift, or a grant? Why is fundraising broken down into gaming and non-gaming? So this is going to help get your booster club on the right track to getting your financials in order. That'll make it simple to file your taxes at the end of the year. In BoosterHub, we have a default budget that comes standard in our accounting program. And if you'll notice, I've got it here next to the 990EZ, that the accounts align very closely with what you see on the 990EZ. What most of our clubs do is they come into this budget and then they put their custom categories under these headers amounts. And that just makes it really simple for them to classify all their income and expenses, and at the end of the year, make their tax filings and their accounting super easy. So, when you're getting started with drafting your budget, you're going to work with a chart of accounts. This is whether you're doing it on paper or doing it in a software program. This is really the various types of income and expenses that you have. I like to classify these as buckets. What bucket does that go in? What bucket are we going to put that in? If you're in a spreadsheet, you may need more buckets just simply because it's harder to filter and categorize numbers across the spreadsheet. So you may need more lines on your spreadsheet. And then you want to ask yourself, do we need to add another bucket in our chart of accounts, or should we look at that information on another report? So an example of that is if you sell merchandise, do you want to see the merchandise line on your budget? Or do you want to see how many t-shirts, how many hoodies, and how much you made in car decals on your budget? So it depends on the size of your booster club and the number of products that you sell into how much detail you want that budget to go in. So you may want to consider secondary reports such as sales reports to work outside of your budget. Now we're to what questions will be asked. Well, generally, the first question we always ask is how much money did we contribute to our program this year? How much money did we fundraise and how much did we spend? These are really the three basic questions that you'll see on any booster club. So a basic budget should answer these questions. So we'll start here with a simple budget and we can see, okay, here's our income. We had some fundraising and we had some expenses. This would work reasonably well for any booster club who just is looking for that information. What happens when the questions get more detailed? So now we want to know, did we make money selling merchandise this year? Do we need to change the prices at concessions? And how much profit did we make on the spring fundraiser? If you're going to ask questions like that, then your budget may need to be more detailed and outline those items. In this case, we have merchandise where we can see how much income and expense came from it. We can see what our concession income was and our concession expenses. And we can also see the total income from the spring fundraiser and the total expenses. We can even get one more level deeper. What questions will be asked in this case? If your booster club covers a whole program, but it's broken down into various sections, such as a marching band or color guard and concert band, and now we want to know, did the marching band raise enough money to cover the trip? Did we cover the cost of color guard uniforms? Does concert band have any funds left from last year? Our budgets and categories may start to look a little bit different. So when we get back to our chart of accounts, we may not be able to just use these simple chart of accounts. We may need to start categorizing our income and expenses. In this case, I'm showing that we've got our marching band income and expense classified so that we could separate it from our concert band and our color guard. A budget for this might look something more like this, where I have the actual budget for each category that roll up into a main budget, and I can see the income and expenses across every category and the whole program. Another sample of this would be, for example, a sports team where you have your main budget, but you do 3 or 4 events a year. So you've got a fall kickoff and perhaps a charity fundraiser, a festival, and a banquet. You may, again, want to see your income and expenses across those events and then across your whole program. You'd probably also likely have things like uniforms and equipment down here in your expenses as well. Again, I go back to, we don't have a budget. We just write checks when the coach asks. If your organization doesn't have a budget, you need to be asking why. It's really important to use your budget as one of the checks and balances in your booster club. And so you really want to be a proponent of making budgeting happen in your booster club. Now let's get to how much to budget. What's needed? So you're going to get the information likely from your program director or your coach. And once you get the number that they need to run the program or buy the piece of equipment, you'll work backwards. So let's say your program needs $20,000. Well, then you're also going to have some standard expenses, and then you're going to need to know how much you're going to fundraise. It's really helpful if you have historical values that you can look back on so that you can look at last year's numbers and say, okay, if we do maybe 5% more than that, we'll be in the ballpark. Don't plan for zero. I see this as very common practice with booster clubs because people think they need to spend everything that comes in. And that's not the case. A nonprofit can roll over a surplus to the next year. I would recommend planning for a 5 to 10% surplus at the end of the year. This is going to help you have enough money for any unplanned expenses. And it also gives you a cushion at the beginning of the year. Perhaps you have to spend money right at the start of your season before you've had a chance to fundraise. Planning with a surplus will allow you to do so. If you have major capital projects, such you're buying a new scoreboard or you're buying a new trailer for your marching band, and it's spread over multiple years, you'll want to include the cash for this particular year in your budget because budgets are done on a cash basis. Don't forget your ordinary expenses like your website hosting, transaction fees, things such as that, because those little things can add up and become a big part of your budget. If you don't have any historical values and you don't have any information from your booster club, even just bank statements from the previous year can be helpful. Just go ahead and guess. Then next year, you can see how far off you were and you can adjust it in the next year. Normally here we do a sample budgeting process, but we save that for our live webinars. If you'd like to see it live, you can always schedule a demo of BoosterHub and we can walk you through our budgeting tool. Now that you've got a budget, how do you use your budget effectively? So you'll want to have the budget available with a budget versus actual and the variance between them so that that can be reviewed at your monthly meetings. You'll want to take feedback from your booster club members and discuss adjustments. If you need to make an amendment to your budget, you'll want to make that a formal process and present it, talk about the difference, and have it approved. Watch out for surprises and red flags, things that are running over budget in expenses or under budget in income. And you'll also want to look at your budget over a period of time. For example, does your booster club do all of its fundraising in the beginning of the season? Then if you're behind in the beginning of the season on fundraising, you're going to want to really watch that. If you're looking at your budget just in certain periods, it can be deceiving. Again, expenses, if all those expenses come in a certain part of the year and you think you're ahead of budget, you want to be careful falling into some of those time frame traps with a budget. At the end of the year, you'll want to review the budget. Was it accurate? Were your numbers close? Do you need more detail in any area? Do you need to add more chart of accounts? Are there large factors that could change your budget in the next year? We saw this in the year with COVID, where a lot of booster clubs had very little fundraising in 2020. So you always want to be looking for those external factors that could impact your booster club and internal factors as well. And then finally, you'll want to use your budget to provide analytics to help people support your program. How much does it cost per student to go through your program? What percentage of that cost is driven by fundraising versus fees from the family? What are your margins on merchandise? Could you be raising money more effectively in that area? These analytics will help you run your booster club effectively. As we wrap up, budgets are really the key to success to a booster hub. They give you your game plan, they help prevent fraud, and they provide a way to communicate what's happening in the booster club to all of the membership and stakeholders. You'll want to have all the stakeholders at the table. You'll want to use great tools. We recommend BoosterHub, of course. You'll want a budget prior to the start of the year. Ask questions, but keep it as simple as you can. Start with the end in mind. Review your budget often and provide useful insights back to your members so that you can get more people to support your program. So the quote that I really like to see is, we have a budget, we know what the students need and how much it's going to cost, and we know how we are going to raise that money. If you have any more questions about budgeting or Booster Club accounting, please reach out to us at BoosterHub or schedule a demo for our program. And we hope you knock it out of the park for your students and families.